Good afternoon. My name is Jim Daughton, and I'm with the firm of Metz, Husband and Daughton, and we're the lobbyists for the Florida bar. It's one of the clients that my firm has, and so they asked me today to come and just chat with you all about getting you ready, I guess, for tomorrow and giving you a little bit of a state of the state, so you know what you're going to be dealing with in your legislative days. A couple of things. I know this is for CLE credit, which is just shocking that anything I have to say you can get CLE credit for, but I want to make sure this is really interactive. We've built in plenty of time for questions. I always say this, there really are no dumb questions. It's a complicated process, and you probably do this in your practices as well. Please just ask, stick your hands up, glad to answer them, whether they're on the script or off the script, if they're political, if they're process questions. I'm glad to do that. So we'll keep this. Thanks, that was awesome. That's a great. Would you like me to say it slowly? That damn Siri. And I'm glad to talk a little bit about my practice too, if you're interested in sort of how you develop a legislative practice as well. A quick question before I blow through the PowerPoint. Have folks been up and lobbied the legislature before? Have you been to Tallahassee and done your day at the Capitol? Hands up if you've done that. Okay, about a little more than half of you. I say that because it's sometimes tough when I talk to audiences that have in-house government relations people who live over at the Capitol and then also dealing with folks who've never been in the process before. But most of you are all in some type of private practice or working for a state agency, but not living over at the state Capitol. Is that right? Good. And by the way, thanks for taking the time to come up. This is, I noticed a lot of folks are from far away, and you came to Tallahassee. Anyone know why Tallahassee is a state capital, geographically why? We got an answer.
Because actually the largest city was St. Augustine and Pensacola and Catholic.
Someone took Florida State Civics in 8th grade. I like that. Excellent.
Actually, I didn't go to school, in elementary school or middle school.
And you get a prize for that.
You get a prize for answering the question correctly.
I never went to school.
Well, a couple of things. This is why, if you're Rick Scott, you're having a pretty good few months, right? If you're Rick Scott and you're going out to talk to people, he has a lot to say about how Florida's doing. And you know, whether he's responsible for that sort of a different issue, but if you're the governor of the state, we're in pretty good shape here, right? Unemployment is down. I don't know what the market did today, but unemployment's down. We've created a lot of jobs. These are sort of talking points. If you're an incumbent legislator or an incumbent statewide elected official, and you can probably tell in your practices, right? More people are buying homes. There's a little bit more investment. Florida is typically one of the first into a recession, as we saw in 2008, and we're also one of the first out. Because what do we really want in Florida to make the economy tick? We want people to come to Disney World and stay for a long time, right, and spend their money. So a lot is going on, big picture, and these are some of the issues that the legislature is going to confront. So as bad as sometimes their politics can be, they're starting in a pretty good spot in terms of how the state economy's doing. I know we're really talking about legislative issues, but I wanted to spend a second too, just on the executive branch, and forgive me if this is a little bit much like a civics class, but remember that Florida has sort of a weak executive branch system. We have a collegial executive, right? So you have the governor and 3 other independently elected cabinet members, and they actually share responsibility over several state agencies, which is kind of weird. If you go to a cabinet meeting, which is every other Tuesday down in the basement of the Capitol, they sit there and they just really put on different hats. So for a few minutes, they're the State Board of Administration. Then they're the trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund, which is really public land stuff. So they wear all these different hats. And it's not just the governor, it's other cabinet members who have a pretty big role too. And they don't always agree. If you remember at the beginning of last year, there was a little bit of controversy over whether to get rid of the commissioner of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, right? The governor's like, hey, I think it's time to get rid of the commissioner. And then about 3 days later, someone said, hey, governor, it takes other folks on the cabinet to make that decision because that commissioner reports to the entire cabinet. So structurally, sort of a weak executive branch system, although obviously personalities come to play in that. And I guess it's been about 10 years ago. We used to have 7 independently elected members. It's down to 4 now, so they've consolidated power a little bit. Some of the folks you're going to see tomorrow, just here's what you have to remember. Florida is a purple state, right? President Obama won twice, right? If you look at members of Florida's congressional delegation, you know, a little bit of Republican, a little bit Democrat. Not necessarily in Tallahassee, though. If you look, the Republicans sort of are running the place. All 4 statewide elected officers are Republican, and the legislature is really dominant, 81 to 39, 26 to 14. Those are super majorities. So you don't need to be a real expert in Robert's Rules of Order to know that when you don't have a third, you're not in the best spot in the world. So, and these pictures happen to be from opening day of the legislative session, which is, of course, tomorrow. So you came at a really good time. Typically, we're here a little early this year. Typically, the legislature doesn't start till March. But, and some people attribute this to political reasons. I really don't. But we're starting 60 days earlier this year. We typically start in March. We go 60 days. Now we're starting in January. Anybody, any ideas why we might be starting in January and not March?
To accomplish something?
Good question. No, actually, well, that is not the answer. So some people say it so the legislature can get done more quickly and have more time in the spring and fall to run for re-election because we have an election in 2016. Other people say it's sort of the Spring Break Act. We have a lot of new legislators in, and we're going to talk about term limits in a minute, but a lot of them really want to be home with their kids during the spring when it's spring break and Little League games and those kind of things. And I can tell you, having watched the legislation go through, it's a little bit political, but there really are a bunch of members who wanted to have some kind of spring at home and just figured, hey, we can get away with, you know, we can start earlier. Some people were worried years ago, they've been talking about this for years, and years ago they were worried that the budget, since it doesn't start till July 1st, that it's really hard to predict, right? Just like in our family budget, like what's the money going to be if they leave in March? What happens if there's a downturn or some kind of problem? But you know, we've gotten a little bit more sophisticated in the way we budget, and so they figure, hey, we can finish early and walk and chew gum at the same time, and so we're trying it out. The Constitution prohibits us from doing it all the time, but they can do it in the January of an election year, so we're going to see how this goes. What that meant was that they were in committee meetings a lot earlier in the process, and a lot of work, of course, gets done in the legislative committee process. You're going to see tomorrow there are going to be bills on the floor, and you're like, well, wait a minute, they just started. How did a bill get on the floor? It's because they're up here a lot for interim legislative committee meetings. And in Florida, they can take action on bills. They can, you know, vote things out of committee. The only thing they can't do is sort of pass a bill off the floor and onto the governor. But all the spade and shovel work that has to happen in committees really happens in committee week. And if you're trying to affirmatively pass something, you want to try and get a hearing on your bill before the start of the legislative session. That's sort of a goal as you sit there and say, okay, what do I proactively have to do? So in many respects, they're kind of halfway over, and the first day isn't as big of a deal as it used to be. As Florida gets to be more complicated, we do a lot more in these interim committee weeks. Opening day isn't, I mean, it's the ceremonial aspects of it, but it is not like, okay, let's file some bills and get started. Actually, the bill filing deadline is tomorrow at noon. So, so don't, you know, think of it when you walk around the Capitol tomorrow that a lot of the spade and shovel work's already been done. And of course, we have about a $78 billion budget, so you have to start on that stuff a little bit earlier, right? I mean, this is not walking around money. This is one of the top 20 economies in the world we're talking about. So it's, you know, it takes some time to do. The only bill that has to pass, of course, is the budget. And if they don't do that, they get to stick around, which they did plenty of times in 2015. I've been very careful. A lot of clients are saying, hey, how do you think the 2016 legislative session is going to go? And I'm like, look, everybody wants to get out on time. It's been a tough year with redistricting cases, and nobody was getting along last year. And so I think everybody's really focused on getting a budget done and getting out on time. The leadership are singles and doubles hitters. They're not, you know, crazies. You know, they really are focused on their issues, want to get things done. And then it occurred to me as I was writing that for a client and about to get on a conference call, I'm like, damn, I said the exact same thing at the beginning of 2015, and look how wrong I was, right? So I'm going to get the number of weeks wrong, but in 2015, they were here like 30-odd weeks, which is a lot of that had to do with reapportionment and how the congressional and legislative districts are drawn. They didn't adopt the budget on time. So I do think as we go into the 2016 legislative session, folks are just sort of ready to be home. And we're going to talk about these legislators in a minute just to understand sort of besides the policy issues, what's going on with them. Any questions on the timing of where things are now? Anybody? Good. So who are these folks? I only did this Speaker and the Senate President. Andy Gardner from Orlando. Anybody from Central Florida? We have some Orlando folks here. Andy Gardner is a Stetson grad, Harvard of the South, delightful DeLand, Florida. And go Stetson, that's right. Go Stetson. I'm a Hatter. As I mentioned, is Joe Negron, the incoming Senate President, a bunch of Stetson grads, and Andy Gardner as well. So Andy got out of school and started as a chamber executive in Central Florida. He works for Orlando Health now in his real job. He served a long time in the House, 8 years, and then moved into a Senate position. So he's been around Tallahassee for a long time. Steve Crisafulli, also from Central Florida. If you're from the Brevard County area, Crisafulli, his family has owned property in Florida for 2 bajillion years, and is one of the sort of the ag interests that have been around for a long time in Central Florida. Obviously, agriculture, water policy issues are his passion. He was not slated to be Speaker. The person who was slated to be Speaker lost his election, so our Representative Crisafulli sort of was elevated to that, and has done a really good job. Again, he and Senator Gardner are both sort of mild-mannered guys, and we expect them, as we'll see how the 2016 legislative session goes. So we all like the fact that there are lawyer legislators in, right? And of course we have a bunch of lawyer legislators in both the House and the Senate. And I think the doctors would probably tell you the same thing, and the real estate folks would tell you the same thing. That's not always awesome, right? You'd think, oh my God, they're going to agree with the Florida bar or agree on legal issues just because they took the bar. Not necessarily the case, right? So it is certainly nice to have lawyers in the legislature. It does not mean they 100% agree on everything that the bar or the sections or Fawl or anybody else wants to do. But if you recognize some of these names from the Senate and also the House, pretty good cross-section too. I want to talk about term limits for a moment. We're going to talk about judicial term limits a little bit later, but a couple of things. Term limits passed in 1994, I believe, overwhelming majority of folks, and it was right about the time 8 is enough was sort of the buzzword, and there's a big anti-Congress kind of feeling, and they passed in Florida pretty easily. And we could sort of have a political science discussion about whether term limits are a good thing or a bad thing, and it is sort of interesting. But I want to remind you that it's not just the 8 years. So these folks get into office. Our Speaker and our Senate President change every 2 years. All the committees, the Judiciary Committee, the Business and Professional Regulation Committee, all the membership and the chairs change every 2 years. So you feel like you've really never solved anything. And after you've done this a few years, you're like, God, didn't I just work on this issue 6 years ago? Well, yes, I did work on this issue 6 years ago. It's just I was the only one. Nobody else in the room was involved because they're all new. And what that means, and I tell our clients this all the time, but for any advocacy organization, it means that the relationships back home become very, very important because the legislators are changing quickly. So if you know your legislator or you need to get your legislator, go visit that person in Tampa. Go visit him or her in Tampa or in St. Pete. It really does sort of push the relationship business down to the local level. I was looking at this at the end of the year. My travel since term limits has come into effect is like just skyrocketed. And I'd like to say it's because we have all these great clients, which we do, but it's really because I want to go see these folks in their district. So we're on the road all the time trying to establish these relationships. And the turnover is incredible. We're going to lose another likely 15 more senators in the 2016 election process. But 15 of 40 were new in 2012. 33 legislators are expected to be termed out. And they could also lose, right? This is just their terms up. They could also lose their election, although that doesn't happen quite as much as you might think. But as you're dealing with the legislature, just think about this constant churn that's going on. And obviously, if you're a House member, they all want to be in the Senate, right? Well, there's 3 House members for every senator, so a lot of times if they have an opportunity to take a Senate seat, they're going to leave their seats early. So the average length of a House term isn't 8 years, it's like 5.5. The other thing is, and what you've probably seen back home, is these jobs don't pay very well. I think they're making $29,500, and I just told you they're up here for 30 weeks last year, so I don't know how many bosses are sort of cool with, hiring somebody to not be at the office all the time, and they're making $29,500 to do it. So a lot of times, if you've been in for a while and you see that county commission seat open up, or supervisor of elections, or clerk of the court, well, those are pretty good paying jobs, right? And you're already in the state retirement system, so you see a lot of hopping from legislative seats into local government seats that pays a little bit better. And you see it reversed too. A lot of city and county council members will run for office, but usually those nice high-paying county jobs and school board are always sort of attractive once you've been in the process for a while. Any questions on term limits? So here's, I think, what the 2016 legislature is going to be dealing with, and I'm glad to go into more details. But if I'm not supposed to use above the fold anymore. I think that gives away my age, right? I think trending is the right word to use, since nobody reads the news. I don't read the newspaper anymore, so I don't know why I haven't changed the slide. But so I mentioned in the first slide the state's doing pretty well, right? So the economy's doing pretty well, which means more money in. So depending on who you talk to, there may be as much as $1 billion, a little over $1 billion surplus. We brought in more money, or we expect to bring in more money during the next fiscal year than we did in the current fiscal year. So what are we going to do? Are we going to invest in education? Are we going to make sure that kids are taken care of? Are we going to cut taxes? What do you think we're going to do? Cut taxes? I think we're going to do all 3. That's right. I think what we're going to do, but we're going to start with, I told you this is a pretty conservative legislature, Republican legislature, so they're sort of a starve the beast. So we're not going to grow government. This legislature is not going to grow government. So likely what they're going to do is cut taxes a little bit. It's an election year, and they're going to spend some money on education. And usually in election year, the big money, we're going to show you the budget in a few minutes, but the big money is between healthcare and education. And in election year, education usually wins. So we'll see what the legislature does with education funding, but I can promise you there's going to be some form of tax relief. Other issues that you see, Uber, I put Uber up here. Uber is sort of an example of what governments are dealing with, not just in transportation, but in everything, right? So we have this thing called the internet, and it's brought a lot more transparency. And in Tallahassee in particular, you have a lot of interests that are sort of a protected class, if you will, right? So you're a plumber, and the plumbers got together years ago and decided they were going to put together a licensure scheme, and they're going to be regulated by DBPR, and they're going to have a board, and they sort of controlled the market. A lot of these young legislators, I mentioned term limits, a lot of these young legislators want to tear down sort of those barriers and have sort of a more open, transparent economy where you don't have industries that are protected via regulation or statute. So Uber, while Uber is certainly going to be discussed and whether we should preempt local governments and sort of get rid of the taxi industry is a big political issue, but bear in mind it's really not about Uber. It's about just about anything that's going on with regulation and sort of the new economy. Any questions on any of these above the fold issues? I wanted to touch 2 of them, but this is what you'll be reading about as the legislative session unfolds over the next 60 days. So I mentioned the budget, and you'll see that healthcare and education are a big chunk of that, and a lot of that's federal dollars too. So one of the controversial issues that the legislature tried to grapple with the last couple of years is whether to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. As you might expect, we are a Republican legislature in the South, so we're not huge fans of the Affordable Care Act or of expanding Medicaid. There was some interest in the Senate to do that the last couple of years. The House not just said no, but held no. I suspect Medicaid expansion will be off the table for this legislative session, but the Medicaid budget's now over $25 billion, so real money, and it takes up a lot of time and a lot of resources from the staff just to grapple with some of these numbers. The other thing I wanted to point out is the judicial branch. That's this thin line over here. This is what the court system gets funded with, and we've had issues through the years as to whether our judges are paid enough, whether there's enough technology, particularly in the circuit courts. You folks in private practice would probably know the answer. Probably know that there's not real great technology in the circuit courts. We found out a couple of years ago we've been working on pay packages for the staff in the circuits, because an administrative assistant, and you can use Tallahassee example, will make $3,000 or $4,000 more if they're an administrative assistant at the Game and Freshwater Fish Commission or at the Department of the Lottery versus if they work in the court system. So it's really been hard, putting the judges aside, it's been really hard to attract folks to work for the judicial branch when we're not paying them as much as somebody down the street for basically the same job. There have been a lot of discussion through the years as to whether we should sort of have a fixed percentage of the budget so that we sort of ensure proper separation of powers. There's not much appetite for that, and there's also, you have to sort of be careful what you ask for sometimes. There's a school of thought that you may want to not lock yourself into a percentage. I'll tell you, yes, go ahead, Kristen.
Does that 1% include the clerks of court, as you've heard so much about the clerks not getting their funding?
Right, that's a great question. So a lot of the clerks' funding is not included in this budget figure, and we've had some controversy through the years as to whether the clerks should be off budget or part of the budget. What the clerks are confronting now, and the bar's been working closely with them. The clerks, they get a lot of their revenue from speeding tickets, I guess, and that funds a bunch of other stuff that the clerks do. And because the tickets amounts were raised, there's been a lot less tickets being written. And I was just floored. I'm like, really? Like that could impact what the clerk of the court's budget could be that dramatically? The answer is yes, it does. It's I think $25.7 million is sort of what the clerk's shortfall is. So they're reaching out to the legislature saying, hey, you know, we have a shortfall here. We have to do something about it, and we can't just always be funded on, you know, sort of how tickets go, right? The legislature bounces back and says, well, you know, sometimes you want to be in the budget, sometimes you want to be out of the budget. We want efficiencies. We'd like the clerks and the courts to run as efficiently as we're requiring other state agencies to do. Well, you know, then you get into, whoa, I'm not a state agency, right? I'm the clerk of the court. I was independently elected. I can do what I want to. And it's like, yeah, but you want some of the state GR money. So anyway, so the clerks have been having, I think, pretty productive conversations about how do we sort of have a more sustainable funding path, how do we avoid sort of the bumps, and also what type of accountability measures, legislature, are you looking for? We all want to run smoothly and efficiently. Any other questions on judicial funding? It's what we spend the bulk of our time working on during the legislative session.
I guess on the issue of the clerks, it wasn't that long ago we had a constitutional amendment to start using certain dock fees to buy land. And I just remember nobody was talking at all about the fact that wasn't that coming out of the clerks? What used to go to the clerks?
Some of those dollars were.
Land.
That's right.
I mean, the money always has to come from somewhere.
Well, that's right.
It wasn't really lobbied on that much, well, to the public.
Right.
For the constitutional amendment.
Yeah, so, you know, and there's a great debate that goes on in Tallahassee about amending the Constitution, and we probably like a lot of the provisions that folks have amended, and you know, the Clean Indoor Air Act is one of them, right? Which is great. You know, we're all anti-smoking now. Not so much 15 years ago when we did it, but the problem is when you amend that Constitution, you have some unintended consequences, and boy, is it hard to fix. And so I think that's a good example that you pointed out. Well, now it's enshrined in the Constitution, and now you need a 60% threshold to amend it. That'll never happen. Any other questions on court funding? I will say that judicial salaries continue to be less competitive as compared to other states. So the circuit court judges and the appellate judges are making a pretty good argument to try and bump their own salaries up a little bit. They don't have the best relationship with the legislature right now because of some of the reapportionment decisions, so we'll see how that goes. Yes, personalities can get involved in those decisions. So you're going to be doing some legislator meetings tomorrow, and I want to take a few minutes and just run through sort of maybe some ideas that will help you be better prepared. And we'll put the policy issue aside for a minute, and just practically, who are these folks and what's a typical day like? A legislator will have 15 to 20 15-minute meetings during the course of a day. I would be very careful to assume the legislator knows anything about the issue that you're there about unless he or she happens to be a bill sponsor. But, just think about this. You have an insurance salesman from Orlando who gets elected to the legislature, and boom, for some reason they get appointed to the Judiciary Committee, and I'm supposed to go in there and say, hey, I want to talk about how we fund the judiciary. And, they're not waking up every day and worrying about, when they ran for office, they're not worrying about how the judicial branch of government is funded and what fees constitute that or how the clerk's office works. So I give the legislators a break. They're just normal citizens, right, who decided to run for office. So we have the education responsibility. There's going to be, 1,300 or so bills that are filed. They're not expected to be experts on all of these things. So just remember, they're not waking up every day and worrying about whoever. Not just the Florida Association of Women Lawyers, but the Florida Bar or Microsoft Corporation or Google or American Express or anybody else. It's not their job to sort of worry. It's our job to educate them, and hopefully they'll do the right thing. But, it's just the insurance salesman or the school teacher or the practicing lawyer, and all of a sudden they're supposed to be experts on how we fund whatever, transportation in the state of Florida with 20 million people, sort of a big deal, and they can't be expected to be real knowledge experts. And I mentioned term limits earlier, and I keep coming back to that, right? So by the time they get to have that expertise, their term's up is usually what happens. Who really runs the place? When you go to meet with your legislator, if you see a legislator tomorrow and you may want to buzz by that staffer, that legislative aide, huge mistake, huge mistake. The staff, of course, runs the place, right? They've made a determination whether you're going to get in to see that legislator. They're going to do any follow-up that's necessary. So stop, introduce yourself to the, usually it's an administrative assistant or the legislative aide, and let them know who you are, where you're from, who you're with, but don't forget the legislative aides. They actually do run the place. And I'm convinced if you take that to another level that there's only about 5 people who actually know how Florida's budget works, how we spend that $77 or $78 billion, and that's all staff, right? So always be nice to the staff folks. I mentioned earlier, they do not wake up every day and worry about Jim Daughton's priority issues, unless I really beg. So bear in mind that they've had a bunch of these meetings, and I cannot tell you, if we had a couple legislators here, I'm sure they would agree. Oftentimes they'll get done with that 15-minute meeting and they're like, I have no idea what the hell that person just said. I have no clue, right? You start and you're talking about acronyms because you know your issue real well, right? So you're speaking in acronyms and you're sort of starting with not telling a story. So it's very much like in the practice law, you're not telling a story, you're trying to get to that conclusion, right? Well, they don't have any background on the issue, so just bear that in mind. Also, find commonality. So if you're a constituent, if you're from Tampa and the legislator you're seeing is from Tampa, awesome, talk about that. You only have 15 minutes, but it's okay to spend a couple minutes saying, hey, where did you go to high school? Oh, I'm here. Where do you live? And anything to kind of draw them in. And I know this is sort of basic meeting etiquette, but it is especially true, I think, in the legislative environment. There may be pictures on the wall. There may be, notes. Just take a look around and try to, here's how this usually goes. I represent physician groups, and I'll have a state senator call me, week 6 or 7 of the legislative session. Everybody's sick, right? Because we're all around, and everybody's shaking hands, and so everybody has something by the end. And I'll get this call. Do you remember that nice doctor lady you brought in? I really need to see somebody. I have this horrible head cold, right? And they're not going to know They're not going to remember the exact name, but they're going to remember they had a pretty good experience, and they may know, yeah, I went to high school with that person, or that person went to the same college I did, and they're just trying to pull it all together. And I'm telling you, it really works to just find some kind of commonality with these folks. And then number 5 is something we all in the legislative process work on. Start at the end, right? So if you're there and you don't think judicial term limits are a good idea, don't wait till 14 minutes and 30 seconds to tell them that and get into all your stuff. Start at the end, right? Hey, we don't like judicial term limits. We encourage you to vote against the bill. Now let me tell you why. But always start at the end. These, social media is rough, and I notice it with my kids, but these folks have no attention span. I mean, I thought I was bad. They have no attention span. So I told you they have no attention span, that they're having 20, 15-minute meetings as the day goes on, that they aren't experts on their issues. So of course you want to start at the end. What are you asking me to do? So keep that in mind. Any questions about tomorrow, how it should work? Start at the end, be nice to the staff are the two biggies, I would tell you. Since we represent the Florida Bar, I thought I'd talk a few minutes about what their priorities are and answer any questions about that as well. I mentioned court funding earlier. It's real important that the judicial branch of government is adequately funded. It's a lot of money out there, and we want to make sure that the court system works. One of the things we do is we reach out to the business community a lot. For those of you real familiar with the system, you understand that if there's cuts to the court system, it's going to be civil litigation that's a real loser, right? And so we've partnered with the Florida Chamber of Commerce and the Florida Retail Federation and Associated Industries of Florida and these other business groups who recognize that you need sort of a well-funded judicial system to make the trains run on time and make have less litigation or have it ended sooner and not dragged out. So we sort of take friends wherever we can. We also, on behalf of the bar, try to keep it all together. Sometimes the circuit judges and the appellate judges may have a little difference of opinion on some issues, but the bar is there for all of them, and our big goal is to make sure we have an efficient system. I'm going to skip term limits and do that at the end. Student loan forgiveness is an issue that's been particularly important to the Young Lawyers Division. It's also been a priority of the bars. It's been politically tough. There's a view that if you're a PD or a state attorney or an assistant attorney general or even a legal services lawyer, that you should get some kind of recognition that you're foregoing maybe higher pay in the private sector. And they thought, well, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could have some form of loan forgiveness if you had to take out a whole bunch of loans when you were in law school, but encourage folks to go into public service, which sounds really good. I'll tell you that, and there's legislation that's moving. There's a bill that's going to be heard this afternoon, as a matter of fact, on loan forgiveness. There's a school of thought that opposes that as well, which is, that the state attorneys and public defenders are great training grounds. It's a great place to get great trial experience, and then folks move into the private sector. Our friends in the state attorneys and PDs come back and say, yeah, we're losing all these folks right after 3 and 4 years, and so we need to figure out ways both to pay them well and to maybe forgive their loans so that we can keep career prosecutors or career public defenders. So that's an issue that's particularly important this year to the Young Lawyers Division. And the Senate bill is moving through the process. There's still some skepticism on the House side, but we'll see how that goes. It's something that we're all working on. Bar dues, if you're a public employee in state government or state attorney PD, wouldn't it be nice if your state agency could pay your bar dues? You would not think that'd be something that the legislature has to get in the middle of every year, but in fact it is. And they have to do it in the back of the budget to give the agencies permission to pay the bar dues of its agency lawyers. It is not always a no-brainer. Sometimes if somebody's mad at the branch or mad at lawyers, they will sort of hold that till the very end. We do not see that permissive bar dues language usually until the night before the budget's done for the year. So that's sort of what stresses us out and keeps us up. It's like, where's my dues language? And where we really do try to rely on those lawyer legislators that we showed earlier in the presentation that say, hey, you can't have a public defender spending $300 and whatever it is. I think it's that much on bar dues. So again, seems like a no-brainer, not necessarily so. Term limits is sort of the big deal issue for this legislative session and probably for the next few years. You have House member, or Senator, Representative John Wood from Polk County, and a state senator, Senator Travis Hudson, who's from Elkton, I believe, which is sort of in the St. John's, Flagler area, who have a proposal to have judicial term limits for appellate judges. Their initial proposal was to have it apply even to current appellate judges. The House bill has already had a hearing. As I mentioned, they start early in the process. It's already had a hearing, and it was amended to be prospective only. Sort of on a parallel track to those ideas that Representative Wood and Senator Hudson had, you have Speaker-designate Richard Corcoran, who's from the Brooksville, Hernando, Pasco area. He's going to be the Speaker of the House, kind of a big deal. This year, he's the Appropriations Chairman. I was joking earlier, he called me about 20 minutes prior to me coming here, and I missed his call. I'm like, oh God, you know, it's either good news or bad news, but it's at least he's calling, right? Anyway, he feels very strongly that there should be term limits in the judicial branch. He thinks it should not be limited to appellate judges. He thinks it should be all judges. So would go even further with that proposal than where Representative Wood is, for example. Obviously, that would take a change to the Constitution, so it has to pass by a 3/5 vote. Right now, I'll tell you the current, on day one or the day before day one of the legislative session, there's not quite as much interest on the issue as there is in the Senate as there is in the House. But again, if you get these big issues going on during the legislative session and then things get traded, right? If it's super important to the House and the Senate doesn't like it but is sort of concerned, sometimes they can, you know, to get them out on time, you don't know what could happen. Yes?
He's actually from our district, or he's part of our district in Pasco County, and he is a lawyer. So I'm just
Yes.
curious, do you know the reasoning why he's behind term limits?
Yeah, so there's not a political motivation. He's not mad at anybody. I think Representative Corcoran would tell you that he is a big proponent of legislative term limits, and he thinks that no one is entitled to sort of be in public office for a lengthy amount of time, and that turnover is good, and it will bring fresh faces into the judiciary. When the issue was first floated in the fall, we wanted to make sure that there was not a knee-jerk reaction from the Florida Bar. So what the Legislation Committee did and the Board of Governors did is sort of sent it out to the business law section and the real property section and all, you know, the bar family, if you will, and try to get input from practicing lawyers. So shocker, the appellate law section had some concerns about it, but so did the business law section and the real property section and the trial section. So we really did try, and the governors tried to poll their constituents, and the Florida Bar took an official position against the term limits proposal, both at the appellate level and at the trial level if the proposal should be amended at some point in time. So the Florida Bar opposes this. We didn't have a formal position when the bill was first heard, so we sort of, you'll see maybe if you go to committees tomorrow, you can get up and say, well, we have some concerns, we haven't taken an official position, but they sort of knew we were heading in that general direction. Yes?
Fawl as an organization also is opposed to it. We voted on it, so I don't know if it's going to hold up.
Well, great. The timing's very good since you'll be at the Capitol tomorrow. And again, I think it's very important when we're representing the bar, you can sort of disagree, but do it respectfully. Representative Corcoran comes to his belief, you know, he really believes it. So, you know, he's allowed to have an opinion and we're allowed to have an opinion. And so it'll be a respectful dialogue, but we do think it's wrong. And probably a lot of the arguments that your legislation committee heard too, that you would lose a lot of the sophistication and knowledge of somebody, particularly in complex litigation, if you had this constant turnover in members. We also have a number of retired DCA judges that don't have a dog in the fight, if you will, that really think it's a bad idea. So I think there was something in one of the business journals today. But this is an issue that we're going to oppose this year. In 2018, on the 2018 ballot, you're going to see a bunch of proposals because the governor, the Senate president, and the speaker get to appoint a Constitutional Revision Commission. Does anybody know about the Constitutional Revision Commission? Okay, they can get directly appointed and put stuff right on the ballot. Representative Corcoran will be the speaker during those appointment times. So I suspect if he's not successful this year, you're going to see it as a priority for the Constitutional Revision Commission or for him in the House when he's speaker. So this is not an issue that's going away, and we are educating legislators left and right on this topic to tell them that the bar thinks it's a pretty bad idea. Any questions on term limits? I'm not going to go, I'll go through these very quickly. These are just a little bit more specifics on the issues that I just talked about. This is a term limits issue, student loans, and the permissive bar dues. So how do you keep up with all this stuff? Paul Hill is the general counsel of Florida Bar, and his shop does a tremendous job of sort of keeping herding the cats from all the various sections and the bar positions and tracking legislation that gets filed. So on the website, there's a legislation committee. There's a great list of all the bills that are being tracked that gives you a real-time update as to what's going on. There's messages from the president. Obviously, the Florida Bar News does a really good job of covering what's going on in the legislature. So flip through that. That would be above the fold, right? Those would be above the fold, still in paper form. And you can certainly reach me or Paul at any point in time. So that's sort of the PowerPoint end of it. Does anybody have any questions as to, how many Floridians are running for president right now? Can anybody? Anybody? How many Floridians do you think are running for president of the United States right now? 4. Okay, we know the easy ones, right? Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio. Anybody from Fort Walton Beach? I know we have some Panhandle folks. Mike Huckabee lives down in Santa Rosa Beach right now. And Ben Carson, I believe, is a Palm Beach County resident. So we have 4 Floridians running for the... Well, that's a whole other... One of the things, because you can't, you often tie in the politics and the policy. So the Tuesday after the session ends is Florida's presidential primary. So you don't know, how that, if at all, is going to play into some of the issues that the legislature addresses the last few days of the session. Don't know, but the timing's sort of interesting. Yes?
On the term limits, I'm usually thinking that legislators care about money. Are you aware of what the cost is to train a new judge? Because I know on the circuit court level, when they're doing the administration, and they're always just like, well, these judges think it's going to cost all this money.
Sure.
Or when I was on the JNC, you actually the point come up, well, the governor would like to have somebody that's already got some digital experience, supposed to cost us to train them. These ideas come up.
Sure they do.
Do we have an idea of what it costs?
Well, so the next committee stop for the House resolution, the Representative Woods idea that just right now applies to appellate judges, it goes to the Appropriations Committee next. They could meet as early as Thursday, by the way. We'll know this afternoon whether they're meeting on Thursday, so there's not a tremendous amount of notice. But that's a committee where they're supposed to do that analysis and see, what the impact of a piece of legislation has on the budget. So I know that the staff has done a pretty good job of calling over to the Office of State Courts Administrator to get those type of numbers. The other information we've been trying to provide is, how long are people serving now, and will this diminish who applies for a judgeship, right? That was one of the points we brought out in testimony in the fall. It's like, well, if you know you're only going to be limited to a specific amount of time, you may be discouraged from joining or from applying because you may have to go back into private practice in the middle of your career, and are you going to give up a full practice to do that if you know you have to come back and build up a practice again after 12 years? So a lot of the sort of the practical implications that you mentioned are sort of the issues we're trying to bring up.
I'm wondering, I guess, just common sense, I think about myself as a new attorney, or when you're new at the AG's office, it takes a couple years to you actually kind of know what you're doing. And I look at them and say, well, every couple of years we're losing warm bodies, so clearly we have a bunch of newbies all the time. What's the argument on the contrary side for term limits? What do the proponents of that, think it will accomplish?
Fresh ideas to the system, an ability to go after people that have been entrenched in their jobs for a long time and are sort of beholden to the status quo, or have sort of made up their mind on an issue and aren't bringing new ideas into the process.
I can see that argument.
Yeah, it's a large percentage of voters agreed with that argument. I can tell you just from a lobbying perspective, so put whether it's good or bad aside, but from a practice perspective, term limit sort of passed when I was just starting out in the legislative process. When I first started, I'd see, sort of these old guys sitting out in front of the watering hole, that's called Clyde's, and it'd be 3:30 in the afternoon and I'm running all over the place, and they were sitting I'm like, wow, that's a pretty good gig, right? How do you get to, just go get a drink at 3:30 in the afternoon? Well, they knew one guy, right? And that one guy had been in the legislature for 40 years, and that's all it took. In a term limited environment, you don't have that as much. So,
Did the legislative aides and stuff that, say, one senator uses, does that person get picked up by the next senator?
Sometimes.
That's where I think your knowledge would follow along.
Sure. One of the things we need to be proud of in Florida, too, I mentioned sort of how the economy is doing, but we have a very, very professional legislative staff. If you were to go to other states, especially other southern states, you would not see near the professionalism. So not only do these legislators have a district aide, or in some cases 3 and 4 aides who work on different pieces of policy, each committee has its own staff attorney, staff director, analyst. So if you go to the banking and insurance committee, you're going to have real expertise at the staff level of people who know banking and insurance issues and are also a resource to the legislators beyond their own district staff. So we're very well run. Every bill that's filed, there's an analysis done. We figure out how much a bill costs. We just don't pass something willy-nilly, to your point earlier. So when you go to the Capitol tomorrow, you're going to see these staff directors and analysts there in committee. You're going to see them around the halls of the Capitol. They are tremendously important to the process. And the argument, what some folks will say is because of term limits, they actually have even more power. Any other questions? Well, great. Thank you very much for your time. Good luck tomorrow. Thank you very much.